Before you get too cozy, just one quick thing. Most people fall asleep before they hit that subscribe button. So if you enjoy these quiet stories and you'd like more tap, subscribe now before your eyes get heavy. You can always drift off right after. I'll still be here whispering the past. Asterisk, the year is roughly 1740 BCE. The sun hovers over the baked bricks of Babylon, casting short, sharp shadows on the dusty courtyard tiles of the scribal compound. You can hear the soft thud of poking into wet clay tablets, the scrape of sandals on stone, and the low murmur of men repeating lines in Sumerian or Akkadian. It is a city of words, written in wedge-shaped strokes, where knowledge is power, and power is tightly held, and here hidden just beyond the threshold of a low inner wall is a girl who isn't supposed to be here. Her name is Ninsen. She is the daughter of a senior scribe, one of the men responsible for maintaining royal decrees, tax records, grain inventories, and temple donations. Ninsen is 12. She watches her father work every day, his fingers swift and disciplined as they press symbols into tablets. At night, when he is asleep or drunk, she steals the practice clay and copies the same signs in secret. She has no stylus, pay of her own. Instead, she uses a sliver of bone from a chicken leg. It dries quickly. Her fingers are sore from the effort, but by now she can write over 80 signs. In ancient Babylon, literacy is sacred. The scribes are among the few granted permission to learn. It men trained from childhood at Oedipus, the tablet houses, where days are long and discipline is strict. Women are not admitted, not because they're incapable, but because the written word is tightly controlled by temples and bureaucrats. Writing is not meant for women who are expected to marry, bear children, and manage household grain, not compose correspondence or transcribe hymns. But Ninsen is different. Her father, drunk, wine and grief since her mother died, is careless. She listens through the curtain when he tutors students. She recites lists of Sumerian synonyms in her head while she grinds grain for bread. When he falls asleep, she tiptoes to the tablet shelves and studies the impressions left in clay. One day, her luck ends. A visiting novice, barely a man. Still, in training wanders into the courtyard earlier than expected. He sees her, a girl crouched by a tablet, her fingers pressing signs. He freezes. She looks up. There's a breath of silence between them, longer than any cuneiform sentence. He turns and runs. She drops the bone stylus and wipes the clay smooth with trembling hands. But it's too late. The next morning, her father is called to the temple offices. She is left alone. She tries to act normal, but the house is silent. Her father returns at dusk, his face unreadable. That night, he burns every tablet in the house, including his own. You will never touch clay again, he whispers. But words cannot be unlearned. The signs live inside her now. She traces them with her finger on the insides of her arms. She writes them in her head when she chews bread. She whispers them to the goats as she feeds them. Weeks pass, then months, and one day a temple official, visits. He is tall, pale-robed. He carries no stylus, just the weight of authority. He asks her father no questions. Instead, he calls for the girl. You have a choice, the official says. You may enter service to Ishtar as a temple maiden, or be married to a trader in your butt. You will not be permitted to remain here. Ninsun is only 13. The choices are exile or imprisonment, dressed in sacred veils. Both options sever her from the world of writing. That night, she weeps quietly beneath the woven reed roof, her face pressed into the palm of her hand. Her father sits nearby, silent, drinking. He doesn't speak. He doesn't look at her. But before sunrise, she finds a flat patch of dirt and draws one last sentence. Just 3 signs, not for anyone else to read, only for herself. What do you think? Those signs said, asterisk, the walls of the temple rose like sandstone cliffs, shadowing the tiled streets below. When Ninsun arrived at the house of Ishtar, her hair had already been shaved, her palms scrubbed with bitter herbs, and her name erased from every household list. She no longer belonged to a family. She belonged to the goddess now. The temple was a world within a world. It smelled of rosewater and old oil lamps, of incense burned until it clung to the bricks. Inside, dozens of girls like Ninsun moved about silently, some barely older, some already hollow-eyed from years inside. They wore long linen robes. They were not permitted to speak unless spoken to. They tended sacred fires, recited hymns by rote, and offered garlands to the bronze statue of Ishtar, who stood tall and cruel-eyed at the center of the main court, her hands outstretched in both blessing and command. No clay tablets were allowed. Bikit in the dormitories, no ink, but still, Ninsun saw it in the corners, in the glances, in the way some girls mouthed words silently as they walked, in the flicker of fingers tracing invisible signs on temple stones. She wasn't the only one. There were others, girls who once belonged to scribes or merchants, or temple servants who'd shared too much knowledge. This placement to strip them of power became, in secret, a different kind of school. Not an Edinburgh with teachers and tests, but a web of quiet resistance. Ninsun met one girl, Lilu, who had once copied trade receipts for her father's spice business. Lilu spoke softly, but her eyes were sharp. She taught Ninsun how to write using the black wax on the inside of date seeds. They etched signs with fish bones, tiny messages, hidden in the cracks of bricks or the folds of robes. They called them ghost tablets, words that weren't supposed to exist. They weren't composing grand poems or copying king's decrees. They were writing notes to each other, lists of food supplies, funny phrases in Sumerian dreams. One wrote, "I miss the sound of river frogs." Another wrote, "I am not a priestess. I am a pot of ink." Some girls started to leave signs for each other every day, a secret language blooming under the gaze of Ishtar herself. But secrets are brittle. One morning, an older girl, Sirit, was gone, no explanation. Her mat had been rolled up and her robe washed and given to another. Ninsen noticed that the small reed mat where Silitu kept her fishbone stylus had been swept clean. And then the inspections began. The priestess started turning over sleeping pallets, searching braids, emptying baskets of figs. One girl was found with a kernel of wax shaped like a tablet. She cried. Another was accused of reciting a line from a forbidden hymn aloud in her sleep. Ninsen and Lilu stopped writing. But they didn't forget. They began to memorize everything. Lists of words, names of cities, weights and measures, lunar charts. Knowledge in the mouth leaves no trace, Lilu whispered. They cannot burn your tongue. So they turned inward. Ninsen became a vessel for words. Every day she would listen to the temple chants, remember them, translate them silently into cuneiform in her head, and then back into spoken Akkadian. Then she would store them, and the next night she would whisper them to Lilu, and Lilu would whisper back. They became an archive, one that could not be smashed, or buried, or drowned. Years passed. The clay no longer called to her fingers the way it once had. Instead, the words simply were inside her. When she walked to the altar, she mouthed the names of ancient kings. When she swept the floors, she recited the old rainfall records from her father's archives. But the world outside the temple had changed. The dynasty was shifting. Rumors floated through the temple walls. New governors, wars with Elamites, drought. The temple itself was under review. The scribes no longer came to visit. The food offerings were smaller. One night, a priestess whispered to the younger girls, "Some of you may be sold. The temple cannot keep us all." Ninsen was now 17. Her name was no longer spoken aloud, but in her head she was still Ninsen, daughter of the scribe who drank too much wine, the girl who once wrote on dirt floors with a bone. She had a choice to make. One moonless night, she gathered Lilu and 2 others and said, "If we are to be sold, then they will never hear what we remember." She proposed a final act, not escape. That was impossible, but a legacy. They would write again, once, carefully, on waxed date pits, hidden in the walls of the oldest temple storeroom, behind the statue of Ananna without eyes, a place no one had entered in years. Each girl would write one phrase, one thing she wanted to survive, one sentence from their ghost archive. Ninsen wrote hers last dot, and when they were done, they placed the wax seeds deep inside a cracked jar, sealed it with clay, and left it behind the statue. Then they waited. 3 weeks later, temple guards arrived, a list of names. Half of the girls were chosen. Lilu was taken to be married to a merchant from Kish. Ninsen was sent to a farming estate south of Sippa to serve in a noble household. She never saw Lilu again, but she never stopped reciting dot in the field, in the quiet of her chores, in the way she named her goats. And years later, when a grandson asked why she whispered to herself, she only smiled and said, "I am full of stories that were not allowed to be told." But what was the phrase Ninsen wrote by on that wax seed before hiding it forever? The estate at Sippa was vast flat fields combed by the wind, hemmed in by rows of barley that moved like fur in the heat. Ninsun had never seen so much open land. Babylon had been tight, shadowed, smoky. The temple had been colder still. But here, everything was open and exposed. She had no sacred duties anymore, no chants to recite, no goddess to serve. She was a servant now, bound by household routines. Her hands were no longer allowed to hold styluses or touch tablets. She scrubbed, ground flour, spun wool. The housemaster, a dull man with bad teeth, paid no attention to Hershey, was just one of many women assigned to the granary. But her mind, as always, was elsewhere. She still recited the rainfall tables. She still remembered the signs for grain, tribute, cattle, and storm. And more than that, she remembered Lilu, the way she'd smirked while reciting the list of Sumerian synonyms for death, the way she'd memorized the measurement system for trade boats, just because it was fun to know. They had never spoken about escape, not seriously. That wasn't how survival worked in their world. You didn't run. You remembered. You didn't defy openly. You copied in your head. You didn't hold a stylus, but you carved letters in the hollow of your mind. And now, here in Swipper, Ninsun began doing something dangerous. She taught. It started quietly. One of the other women in the household. Her name was Ayalok. Could not count the grain sacks properly. Ninsun showed her how. Using stones, she explained the symbol for 10, the one that looked like a cluster of wedges. Ayala didn't care about the writing, but she liked the trick. She told another woman, then another. Soon, there were 4 women gathered near the edge of the granary at dusk. They weren't learning to read in the scholarly sense, not hymns, not legal documents. They were learning what a scribe would never have bothered to teach. Dim, how to record how many sheep were lost, how to remember which man had promised them a jar of barley, how to calculate how many days a child had been sick. They learned cuneiform, the way children learn lullabies, through rhythm, repetition, and quiet necessity. Years passed. Ninsun grew older. She was never married, perhaps because her name had once appeared in a temple registry, or perhaps because her eyes still had that flicker of silent defiance. Whatever the reason, she remained in service. She became the cook, then the steward. By the time she was in her 40s, she had taught over a dozen women how to read symbols, not perfectly, not for poetry, but for practical life. They memorized signs for food, weather, illness, and birth. They could identify names. They could mark trade routes. Some even taught their daughters. She never called it teaching. She said, "It is useful to know." But still, she worried if the housemaster ever found out. If the priesthood learned she had spread forbidden signs to lower women, the punishment would not be light. So she asked the women to be discreet, to never write on actual tablets, to teach only in whispers. And that's how the knowledge traveled quietly, secretly, like wind over grain. Until one day, a girl named Yashi, too bold for her age, decided to press her symbols into wet clay for fun. Her tablet was found by a house guard, brought to the master, and within hours, Ninsun was summoned. She stood before the housemaster, now older and even duller, but sharp enough to understand that a woman teaching other women to write was a threat. Not a political threat, no. This wasn't about treason, but something deeper. Disruption, disorder, the unspoken contract between men and women, where power flowed one way and silence the other. You taught her, he said. Ninsen didn't deny it. The punishment was swift, not death. She was too valuable, but her fingers, two of them, were broken. It was an old punishment, a quiet one, no public shame. Just a hand that would no longer move quite right. By reminder, she was sent back to work, but even broken fingers do not silence a voice, and by then the knowledge had already spread. Yashi remembered everything, and she taught it to another girl, and another. They didn't need styluses. They had memory. They had rhythm. They had old songs with words that only they understood. Ninsen lived to see 3 generations of girls whispering wedge-shaped words in the granary. She died in her 60s, quiet and uncelebrated, buried in a simple clay pit beside the house. No grave marker, no tablet, nothing written, except the memories she had planted in the minds of others. 2 centuries later, during a palace renovation, workers in Babylon cleared debris from an old shrine of Ishtar I. Long sealed dot behind a cracked statue of the goddess stood a jar. Inside it were dozens of waxy seeds. Some were too degraded to read, but one bore 3 faint signs. Modern scholars debated its translation. Some claimed it read, "I still know." Others argued it said, "I was here." A few insisted it meant, "I remember, Clay." We'll never know for sure, but maybe that was the point. Asterisk, the Library of Alexandria. A name you already know, even if you don't remember where you first heard it. A place cloaked in wonder, in sorrow, in flame. But before the fire, before the fall, before history turned it into a symbol, it was simply a building, pale, a place where people worked, cleaned, waited, and one of those people was a girl with dusty hands and borrowed eyes. Her name has not been recorded, but we will call her Charis. She was not a scholar. She was not wealthy. She did not wear the pale linen robes of a philosopher, nor carry scrolls tied in ribbons. She was a maid, 13, maybe 14. Her mother worked in the kitchen attached to the Sepium, and Charis was given her first tasks when she was still small enough to hide behind a storage urn. Her job was simple: sweep the sand, brush the shelves, and never ask questions. The great library by then was already past its first golden peak. It was no longer the untouchable heart of Ptolemaic brilliance. The Roman annexation had reshaped its walls, diluted its independence, but even in its quiet decline, it held thousands of scrolls and parchments, texts in Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, Persian, and tongues long since faded from conversation, and it held secrets. Not only about stars and mathematics, but about bodies, about medicine, about rituals and rites and cures the Empire frowned upon. Among these scrolls were ones labeled prohibited, tucked into restricted sections, meant only for select philosophers or government-appointed readers. Caris didn't know this at first. She didn't know about the gates and the keys and the politics, foul of knowledge. All she knew was that she loved the sound the parchment made when the wind rustled through the higher windows, that the scent of ink lingered longer than the smell of bread, that sometimes she would find a line half erased on the edge of a shelf and spend an hour memorizing it. She couldn't read, not yet. It began with numbers. One of the scribes left a list on a slate, simple tallies of scrolls, arranged in columns. Her job was to count the rows, verify the bundles. She noticed that the same mark appeared every 5 lines. Then another mark, simpler, was used to count singles. She traced them with her finger. They made sense. Then came a label on a crate: Pi Epsilon Rho Tau Nu Chi Theta Y Omega Nu on fishes. She did not know what it said, but she copied it, scratched it into the dirt, repeated it. The next day, she asked one of the older kitchen boys, who had once served a Greek trader, what the letters meant. He laughed. "It's about fish," he said, and walked away. But something in her shifted words were knowable. She became obsessed. She cleaned slowly, lingering by the labeled shelves, whispering words under her breath. She copied them into the edges of Perm, memory Greek, Latin, Coptic. No one noticed. No one cared what the maid did with her mouth shut and her broom moving. Until one day, she was caught. A junior scribe, barely older than she was, found her sounding out syllables beside a locked shelf. She froze. He stared. Then, instead of reporting her, he smiled. "You want to read?" he asked. She nodded. He offered her a scroll. The next day one, already damaged, set aside for disposal. It was an herbal text, simple, old, annotated in multiple scripts. Caris studied it at night, using a cracked oil lamp and a finger for tracing. Within a month, she could identify 20 Greek words. By the end of the year, she could read full lines, and that's when the danger began. The library had rules. Women, unless they were born into specific scholarly families, were not permitted in the deeper sections, certainly not girls who swept floors. The idea of a maid accessing banned scrolls, even by accident, was unthinkable. But knowledge changes you, even when you try to hide. She began answering questions too quickly. She suggested a better way to sort the bundled scroll. She corrected a label once, reflexively. The scribes noticed. Not all of them were amused. One day, a scroll went missing. It was a minor work on dyes and pigments, but its absence caused a quiet storm. Fingers pointed, accusations flew. Caris had nothing to do with it, but she had become visible. And for girls like her, visibility was dangerous. She was summoned to the head archivist. The man did not shout. He simply asked, "What do you know?" She said, "Nothing." He smiled. That's the correct answer. She was dismissed from the library that same afternoon, back in the kitchen. Her mother said nothing. They both knew better. Caris returned to cleaning floors this time. Not marble aisles lined with scrolls, but soot-stained tiles beneath roasting spits. She didn't speak Greek aloud anymore. She didn't look at parchment, but she still remembered the symbols, still whispered lines from the herbal scroll into the air just before sleep. And yet the question lingers. What would have happened if no one had noticed her learning? If the scroll had never gone missing? Keris didn't speak of the library again, not even to her mother, who understood more than she let on. The kitchen was loud, the work endless, and her days filled with the monotony of chopping onions, hauling amphorae, and scrubbing animal fat from stone basins. But still, the words lived. They survived in her fingertips, in the careful way she aligned oil jugs on the shelf according to the Greek letters she remembered. They whispered themselves in the back of her throat when she counted figs aloud. The scroll may have been taken from her, but the knowledge was not. That's how it is with language. Once it moves into you, it does not leave quietly, she found. New ways to learn. Scraps of old wax tablets were sometimes discarded near the markets. She rescued the most intact ones, cleaning them with salt water and smoothing them with a pebble. A burnt reed made for a crude stylus. When no one was watching, she would copy grocery lists she saw on merchant stalls. She practiced prices, weights, and verbs. A spice vendor once noticed her squinting at his receipts and said, "Why so curious, girl?" "I like the shapes," she said. He chuckled. "Better stick to olives." She did not argue. But that night she copied the names of every spice on his stall phonetically, from memory into a damp patch of earth behind the kitchens. One day, while cleaning fish near the Serapeum's side stairs, she heard familiar steps. It was the young scribe, the one who had once given her the herbal scroll. He had not spoken to her since her dismissal, but now his voice was careful. "They say you're clever," he said, eyes on the ground. "I'm quiet," she replied. "Would you like to earn a scroll?" he asked. She hesitated. Doing what? Carrying things, delivering notes. Quietly, Keris nodded, so it began again, in the marble halls of the library, but in its shadow. She became a runner, not formally, not with permission, but she was fast, careful, invisible in all the right ways. She delivered messages between scholars, too paranoid to be seen speaking. She carried wax seals, not knowing their contents. Sometimes she swept floors near private meetings and was told to forget what she heard in return. The scribe gave her scraps, not whole scrolls. Fragments, he tore the edges off documents that were already duplicated or damaged. Small lines, quotes, recipes in 2 languages. She studied them under moonlight. Her Greek improved, so did her Coptic, and one day she read something in full. Not a prayer, not a law, a poem. It was a hymn to Isis, inked faintly across an old temple inventory. It read, "O Mother of Morning, Guardian of scroll and silence, may your words dwell in the mouths of women as the Nile dwells in the valley." She wept not because of its beauty, but because no one had ever told her women had a place in the sacred texts. She began to look differently at everything, at the shelves, at the scribes, at the priests who entered the Serapeum with scrolls tied in leather, and she began to notice something. Strange women were mentioned, briefly, quietly, hidden in the margins of calendars, in the fine print of temple expenses, in the footnotes of translations. She saw one line in a commentary on Herophilos of Chalcedon that mentioned a midwife who challenged a diagnosis. No name, just she was correct. Another fragmenta letter between scholars referred to a woman who read the stars but was warned not to. These were not characters in myths. These were real, forgotten, or buried. She began to collect them, not on parchment, but in her mind, a growing list, until once again she was seen. It wasn't the scribe this time. It was a visiting Roman official who spotted her staring too long. At a shipment of texts, he asked a question, Latin. She answered in Greek. That was her mistake. A maid was not supposed to be fluent, not in any language. 2 days later, she was dismissed. This time, no explanation. The scribe who had helped her vanished. Her mother refused to speak of it, but Charis was no longer a child with dusty hands. She had tasted the world. Behind the scrolls she had read, memorized, understood, till she had seen the patterns. In how knowledge was hidden, hoarded, reshaped, and now she chose silence. But it was no longer the silence of obedience. It was the silence of a protection. She left Alexandria soon after, took a job in a coastal port, passed for illiterate, kept her eyes low, and slowly, quietly, taught 3 other women to read, 1 scroll fragment at a time. But what became of the names she memorized? The forgotten women in margins. Did anyone ever write them down again? Asterisk, the port town where Charis fled was smaller, saltier, and far less enchanted than Alexandria. Gone were the marble columns and papyrus groves. Here, the air stank of fish, brine, and rotting wood. The docks were splattered with gull droppings, and the streets slick with oil runoff from merchant ships. But for Charis, it was sanctuary. The innkeeper's wife, an older Greek woman named Lysandra, gave her a job in the laundry quarters. No questions asked. There was no library here, no scrolls, no whispers of forbidden knowledge, but there were women who noticed things, who listened, and eventually, who asked. The first was a young woman named Petra, newly married to a wine merchant. She asked Charis one evening, "What's that word you always mutter when you fold the linens?" Charis paused. She hadn't realized she'd been speaking. Pool, aloud. "It's just a name," she replied. "Whose name?" Charis hesitated. "A woman who read the stars." Petra laughed. "What sort of woman does that? The kind who was warned not to." Something flickered behind Petra's smile. That was the beginning. Petra began helping Charis in the evenings, folding faster than necessary, lingering longer than needed. She would bring bits of charcoal and broken pottery shards. "Show me 1 letter," she would whisper. "Just 1. Charis relented. 1 turned into 3, then 10, then the whole Greek alphabet. They practiced after dark, using seawater and slate stones to copy names. Charis taught Petra how to spell Isis and Demeterand, then her own name, then merchant terms, then numbers. Petra taught her husband to think. She was obsessed with embroidery. By the time spring came, 2 other women joined them. They worked in silence, not because they were afraid. They were, but because they were beginning to understand the power of learning to see the world in ink. Charis never claimed to be a teacher. She never held a stylus. Again, but her mind held the names of women, those who had passed unnoticed between scrolls, who lived only in footnotes and edges and scribbled comments. She began writing them down, not on paper, on waxed wooden tablets, reused from shipping crates. With charcoal and goat hair brushes, she wrote the names phonetically, carefully. Every name she had seen or remembered from her time in the library. The midwife, the herbalist, the stargazer, the translator, the girl who memorized rainfall patterns. Each entry was brief. She corrected a priest in the diagnosis of a fever. She copied scrolls backwards to memorize them in secret. She wrote her own name inside the cover of a Roman text and crossed it out again. She called it her shadow scroll. It wasn't legal. It wasn't formal, but it was real. And as word spread quietly among port women, laundry girls, olive sellers, dock wives, more came to learn just their names. Too. Write just one thing. Charis never asked for anything in return. Just one rule. Don't tell your husband. They laughed, but they obeyed. Years later, when she was in her 40s, Charis gave the waxed scroll to a woman who had come from inland Moria, a former priest's daughter who had fled a forced betrothal. She could read both Latin and Hebrew, and when she saw the shadow scroll, she gasped. "This is valuable," Moria said. Charis shook her head. "It's memory." Moria added 2 more names, then took the scroll. She said she was traveling to Tyre. She would copy it again. Quietly, Charis. Never saw her again. She remained in the port city, married no one, spoke little, but every now and then she would hear a word in Greek, uttered oddly mispronounced, but known. Or she would see a child drawing letters in sand. She would smile softly to herself, because the Library of Alexandria may have lost its walls, but its echoes lived on. And one day, a century later, a merchant from Tyre arrived in a different port with a small, cracked wooden board wrapped in linen. On it were faint names, women's names, many of them unknown to scholars. One was simply signed Chi, Y, Rho, Iota, Sigma, Charis. Not a famous scribe, not a philosopher, just a maid, but perhaps the only maid whose silence became a library. Asterisk, the bells of the monastery rang with a sound that echoed for miles hollow, low, metallic. Not loud enough to wake the world, but insistent enough to keep it steady. Inside the high walls of the convent at Remiremont in eastern Francia, the sound marked everything. Prayers, chores, sleep, silence. And yet, for one woman within those stone corridors, time was not kept by bells. It was kept by letters. Her name, was Adelindzel, born sometime in the early 9th century. She entered the convent as a young girl around the age of 12, perhaps younger. Like many noble daughters in Carolingian Europe, she was not given to the church by choice. She was placed here an offering from a wealthy family seeking divine favor and political alignment. To outsiders, the convent was a holy retreat, but within, it was a kingdom of rules and whispers. Asterisk. Remiremont was no ordinary religious house. It was known as a Reichsatien Imperial, abbey granted special privileges by the Holy Roman Emperor. Its nuns were canonesses, technically bound by looser rules than cloistered sisters. They retained property, read Latin, and lived in relative comfort. But that comfort came with expectations. Women like Adelindis were expected to be loyal, quiet, useful, and illiterate outside the Psalter. But Adelindis had a mind for structure. She noticed things others didn't. When the bells rang wrong by just a second, she felt it. When the chant notation was slightly off, she flinched. When the abbess recited from a Roman legal codex and skipped a line, bet, she knew, because she had read it. The convent had a small scriptorium, a copying room where manuscripts were transcribed by candlelight. Most of the sisters simply traced letters, word by word, without understanding. They copied prayers, psalms, saints, biography, nothing dangerous. But one nun, a woman named Godland, had once served at Charlemagne's palace school. She had kept some texts, legal ones, administrative ones, and Adelindis found them. She read them quickly, hungrily, capitularies, land treaties, Frankish decrees. They explained things no one had ever told her. How taxes were collected, how marriage contracts were written, how a woman could technically own land in 2 kingdoms if she never married. She didn't read these for power. She read them because they made the world make sense. Then she found something stranger, a letter hidden inside a faded codex on St. Jerome's translations, folded neatly, inked in a more hurried hand. It wasn't a letter of prayer. It was correspondence between 2 bishops, discussing the suppression of a female preacher in the Pyrenees. One bishop argued she was heretical. The other said, but she quotes the epistles correctly. The letter ended with, her literacy is more dangerous than her sermons. Adelindis folded the letter back. Her fingers trembled. It changed her. She began searching more carefully. She noticed how many manuscripts had male names crossed out and rewritten, how margins were scraped clean with pumice. She found evidence that some psalms were altered, slightly phrases changed from feminine to masculine. She didn't understand it all, but she saw it, and she began writing not sermons, not poetry, notes.observations.on, scraps of wax, folded into the bindings of her own psalter. Her thoughts were sharp. If women are made in God's image, why must their names be removed from his books? If silence is holy, why do only women keep it? She never spoke these aloud. But one day, during Mass, the visiting abbot from Reichenau asked a question, bowed a passage from a Merovingian charter. No one answered until Adelindis did, quietly, clearly, citing the text and year. The chapel fell silent. That evening, she was summoned. The abbess looked tired. She did not ask why Adelindus knew that text. She simply said, "We are watched." Adelindus nodded. "I will not ask what else you've read." Another nod. "But you must burn anything not approved." A long pause. "I will not check." That night, Adelindus walked to the edge of the garden, where the frost had just begun to touch the grass. She did not burn her notes. She buried them, wrapped in waxed linen, marked with a single letter, Q for Quistio. Question: but what did Adelindus write in those hidden scraps? What questions were too dangerous for even a canoness to speak aloud? Winter. Be settled around the abbey like a second set of walls, colder, heavier, more watchful. The windows were sealed with oiled hides. The ink froze in its pots. Fires were rationed, and yet Adelindus did not stop working. She copied psalms with a steady hand, sang her part in the liturgy, and never once spoke again during lessons. But her mind was alive. She had not buried all her notes. Some she kept hidden in the bindings of books, or slipped beneath the stone tiles of her cell. Written on wax tablets and thin shavings of parchment, scraped smooth and reused. She was not a rebel. She did not dream of rebellion. She did not even want to leave. She simply wanted to understand. Her writings were not dramatic. There were no manifestos, no cries for change. Instead, her entries read like questions. Why are women forbidden to translate scripture, but permitted to copy it? If silence is the proof of holiness, why do the most silent women hold no authority? Why does the rule of Saint Benedict allow for female readers, but not female teachers? Over time, she added footnotes, small notations in the corners, sometimes just a single word, alterata, changed. Sometimes a phrase, esclusa di margine, excluded from the margin. She was building a silent record, a catalogue of erasures. She noticed how Mary Magdalene was described differently in 3 texts. In one, a follower. In another, a penitent. In the third, not mentioned at all. She marked it, and then, one day, a traveling monk arrived. He carried books, mostly hagiographies and chant manuals. But one scroll caught Adelindus's eye. It bore the seal of Tours, and it referenced female acolytes. She asked to borrow it for copying. The monk refused, but she offered to help him sort the manuscripts, citing her reputation for neatness. He agreed, and that night, as he slept in the guest dormitory, she copied 1 page onto wax, carefully, line by line. No embellishments, just the facts that in certain churches, women had once been permitted to carry the Eucharist to the sick, that this practice had been quietly discontinued. No one had told her this. No one taught this in the Abbey Dot. But now she knew. She began cross-referencing Dot. She gathered copies of church rulings, synodal records, papal decisions, local decrees. Sometimes they arrived with visitors. Sometimes they were copied and stored in the small convent library. She noted every mention of women, however brief. She created a system of codes to mark types of exclusion. A small triangle for custom, not law. A broken circle for erased reference. A dot beside a name for mentioned only once. Her psalter became more than a book of prayers. It became a concordance, and still she spoke to no one. But not everyone was blind. Sister Meganhild, a younger nun with a soft voice and pale lashes, once asked her, "Why do you write so much at night?" Adelindis smiled. "So I don't forget." "Forget what?" "How things used to be." Meganhild looked confused. "There's only now," she said. Adelindis nodded. "That's what they want you to believe." Rumors began to spread that Adelindis had strange books, that she copied from texts she wasn't allowed to read, that she had said once, long ago, something about bishops and female preachers. Nothing concrete, but in a house ruled by silence. Even whispers were dangerous. The abbess called her again. She was older now, thinner, her hands marked by years of cold ink. "I have received letters," she said, "from the abbot of Fulda. They are requesting more detailed reports of our teaching practices." Adelindis remained still. "You are not accused," the abbess added, "but you are known." Pause. "I suggest you stop." Another pause. "I will not ask again." Adelindis returned to her cell and sat in silence for a long time. Then she took the psalter, her psalter, and slowly, over the course of several nights, she removed each coded mark. She erased every triangle, every broken circle, every dot. But she did not burn them. She recopied each annotation onto a separate sheet. She wrote no names, no locations, just a list of exclusions, marginalizations, silences. It was not a protest. It was a preservation before the first frost of the next winter. She asked to be transferred to a smaller priory near the Rhine, one known for taking older sisters into quiet retirement. The abbess allowed it. No fanfare, no farewell. But as she left, Sister Meganhild slipped a folded wax tablet into her cloak. "I saved it," she whispered. "The thing you wrote, about the woman who quoted Paul better than the bishop." Adelindis said nothing, but her hand trembled slightly as she tucked it into her sleeve. What was it, in the end, that made her continue? What kept her writing, even when she knew it would never be read? Was it belief, memory, quiet defiance, or something simpler? A desire to leave proof that she had seen the gaps, and chosen not to look away. Asterisk. The priory at St. Morwald Bytherin was smaller than Remiremont by half, and colder by twice. The stone walls were older, more cracked, and the housed only a few tattered volumes of Gregory's dialogues and local saints' vita. No visitors came here. No bishops sent letters. It was a place for women to grow old quietly, to forget the world of the abbey and focus only on prayer, wool spinning, and waiting for death. Adelindis arrived with no possessions but her psalter, a single cloak, and a sealed packet of thin calfskin folios tied with red string. Asterisk. The abbess, Hera-round woman named Gertrude, welcomed her with a nod and offered her a place beside the fire. "You'll like it here," she said. "No one cares what you know. wasn't meant unkindly, but it landed heavily, because Adelindis had come here to disappear. Asterisk. For the first season, she spoke little. She mended veils. She taught one of the older sisters how to treat parchment for reuse. She sang from memory when the hymnals fell apart. But the silence gave her time, too much time. And with it, a dangerous idea returned. Could she make something lasting? Not secret, not erased, not coded, but real. At night, when the others slept, she lit a taper and unrolled her hidden folios. She organized her annotations into themes, mentions of women in canon, law, differences in gospel translation by gendered scribes, female saints with doctrinal authority, cases of unnamed women being described by intellect. She called it her Book of Gaps, because that's what she had always noticed, not what was said, but what had been deliberately left out. Each entry was short, some as brief as Hildegard, once quoted in a homily, now listed only as the recluse. Others were longer, in the Ocken Psalter. The word discipula is erased and overwritten with famula. Same ink, different hand. She was careful. She wrote nothing political. No opinions, only observations. But they were powerful in their simplicity. And then one morning, in early Lent, something strange happened. A cart arrived at the priory gates. On it were books by a noble widow whose estate had dissolved. The women gathered around, picking through moldy missiles and torn calendars. Adelindis found a slim manuscript with a faded blue cover. Inside it, letters from the palace school of Charlemagne, uncopied, mostly useless, but one leaf had a marginal note, likely written by a woman. In soft script, faded to grey, were 7 Latin words. Let those who know teach in silence. Adelindis pressed her fingers to the ink, a confirmation, a signal, a sister. She copied, bit into her Book of Gaps. Then she added her own line beneath it. Let those who teach leave proof. She knew what she was doing. If anyone found it, she would be excommunicated at best, declared unfit or heretical, or simply removed. But she didn't stop. She began making a second copy, one to hide, one to leave behind. When the copy was finished, she wrapped it in oilskin and placed it inside the lining of a hymnal that had not been opened in years. Then, in small script on the first blank page, she wrote only, "For the one who wonders why." She knew no one might ever read it, but perhaps someday a girl would sing from that hymnal, find the spine too heavy, and open it too far. And then, see, Adelindis died in her cell one spring night during Compline. No candles were lit for her hurt. Death was expected, not mourned. She had been old, silent, obedient. They buried her in the cloister garden with no epitaph. No one read her Psalter. No one checked the old hymnal. But the Book of Gaps survived. It resurfaced over a century later, in Mainz, inside the collection of a scholar monk who listed it simply as miscellaneous observations. He never cited it, but he never threw it away. And when future generations stumbled upon it quietly, uncertainly, they saw not a protest, but a pattern. A pattern only visible because one woman, in silence, had decided to keep track. Asterisk, the air in Luoyang in early spring is thick with the scent of thawing earth and damp ash. Smoke rises from thousands of low courtyards as household servants burn kindling beneath cookpots, and thin breezes carry the smell of fish sauce, melting wax, and the dry ink of scribes hard at work. In one such courtyard, quiet, walled, and largely forgotten by the busy thoroughfares of Han China, woman sits near the stove with a brush in her hand. Her name is Shen Qilin. She is the daughter of a minor official and the wife of a Confucian scholar. She is not famous. She has never traveled. Her feet are bound only loosely, and her silks are plain. But she knows how to read, and more dangerously, she knows how to write in the early 1st century CE. During the Eastern Han dynasty, literacy was a gate built high and guarded fiercely. Men, especially sons of the literati, were trained to read the Confucian classics. They studied the 5 books, learned the structures of rights and hierarchies, and prepared for court service through examination and patronage. Women, by contrast, were expected to embody the teachings, not understand them. They were to be obedient, silent, well-mannered, and above all useful. Qilin was all of these, and more, her husband. Liang Wen was often praised as a quiet man with an exceptional mind. He held a position as a junior teacher at the local academy. His lectures on the Book of Rights drew small but serious audiences. What no one knew was that half his commentaries were Khoritan each night. By the dim light of an oil lamp, Qilin would read over the texts he was assigned to teach. She corrected his interpretations. She added She noticed inconsistencies between the Analects and the Book of Documents. Liang Wen did not object. He admired her mind. And he believed, perhaps naively, that what was shared in private did no harm in public. Until the year, a provincial magistrate paid a surprise visit. It began innocently. The magistrate stayed for tea, praised Wen's recent work on filial piety, and casually asked how he had come to such refined clarity. Wen, proud and forgetful, replied, "My wife's eyes often see, straighter than mine." The words floated into the room and settled like ash on lacquer that night. A letter arrived. It was unsigned, but it warned that rumors of a woman advising on sacred texts had reached the ears of the prefect. Qilin's name was not mentioned, but the meaning was clear. In the days that followed, when removed her notations from his manuscripts, he stopped discussing the classics with her. He began burning her scrolls, some written in her own hand, others annotated in hers. Qilin said nothing, but her heart recoiled like a thread, pulled tight, because while he could discard her notes, he could not erase what she had already read. She began writing again, in secret. She used the kitchen ledgers. No. One questioned the stacks of bamboo slips she kept by the stove after all. Managing a household required accounts, inventories, schedules. What no one knew was that the ledgers were written twice. One side held the record of grain and oil. the other the back, always written in a shorter, tighter script, held her thoughts, her questions, her observations. One entry read, "If woman is to be humble like water, why is she punished when she reflects too clearly?" Another, the classic of filial piety, praises a mother's devotion. But what is she permitted to know? She copied lines from Ban Zhao's treatise, Lessons for Women, and added her own responses beneath them, sometimes in agreement, sometimes in quiet protest. She never showed these two when he had grown distant. He no longer read in the evening. He spoke little, but once, late at night, as she was brushing characters onto a slip of bamboo, he stood in the doorway. He said nothing. He looked at the fire, then at the ink, then turned and walked away. Months later, Killen's life took another turn. Liang, when was reassigned, sent to a rural district far from Luoyang. Killen accompanied him, as expected. But in the new town, something shifted. She had more time, less scrutiny. No one knew her face. And so, when a local girl appeared at the gate asking for help, reading a scroll left behind by her brother, Killen paused, then nodded. It was just one lesson, just one scroll. But it became 2, then 5, then 10, then soon 3 village girls were sitting quietly each week in Killen's courtyard, learning to sound out Confucian lines. Their fathers never thought to teach them. Killen never called it a school. She called it boiling water together, a code, a cover, a gesture toward something soft and ordinary. But what if someone found out? What if the wrong official saw the wrong bamboo slip? What would they do to a woman who taught the Analects to peasant girls? Asterisk, the girls came at dawn, while the streets were still blue with mist and the wells had not yet been drawn. They slipped through the side gate of Shen Killen's courtyard with their feet wrapped in soft cloth to keep from making noise. There was no formal greeting, no written schedule, only nods, a kettle heating over coals, a folded mat in the corner, a scroll placed on a low wooden table. They sat close together, 3 students and 1 teacher, and they read not poetry, not law, but classics, the same texts used to train male officials for imperial service. Killen called the gatherings boiling water because that's what they looked like from the outside. A housewife helping younger girls learn the timing of fire and pot, measuring rice, reading labels. No one would suspect anything different. Even her husband didn't interfere. Liang Wen had retreated into a quiet sadness. His reassignment had wounded his pride, and the growing scrutiny from other scholars had left him unsure of his place. He spent his days composing dry essays on ancestral propriety. He no longer asked Killen for commentary. Perhaps he sensed her new defiance, or perhaps he preferred not to know. The girls she taught were from modest households. One the daughter of a potter, another the niece of a grain merchant, the third an orphan taken in by temple workers. They had no ambitions of office or publication, but they had questions, real ones, and Killen had made it her vow never to silence a question, simply because it was a girl asking. Asterisk. Why must a woman kneel to a younger brother if she is older? Why is the sage always male? Why is virtue described in silence, but ambition in speech? Killen answered carefully, thoughtfully. She did not challenge the classics. She asked more of them, and that, perhaps, was the greater threat. She taught them how to recognize inconsistencies between translations. She showed them how certain passages were copied differently, depending on the scribe's region or rank. She taught them to notice, and in return, they brought her things: old scrolls found in storage rooms, slips with miswritten characters, lines copied from temple walls. Each became part of a growing shadow anthology, a collection of notes and fragments, Killant, kept in a rolled bundle hidden beneath a floorboard. Its title, inked in faint strokes: Questions a Man Would Not Ask. They studied through summer, and in the 7th month, something changed. A young official arrived in town, fresh from Luoyang, eager to make a name. His name was C.H. Shu Yanqi. He was clever, ambitious, and devoutly Confucian. He visited households, inspected registers, and asked questions too many. One day, he noticed the potter's daughter writing names in sand outside the grain shop. He asked her, "Who taught you?" She answered, "No one. I just see characters." The next day, her mother pulled her from the lessons. The day after, the niece stopped coming too. Only the orphan girl Mai remained. Mai was bolder than the others. She stayed even when Keelan told her to stop. "Let them watch," she said. "I won't stop until you do." Keelan hesitated. Then they continued, but quietly. They burned the rice husks faster, so the smell of cooking would hide the scent of ink. They wrote in soot and water, not brush and ink. They practiced only after dark. One morning, Liang, when found one of Killen's annotated scrolls on the edge of her sleeping mat. He held it. "Read it." It was a passage from the Book of Changes, with a note beneath. "A woman may not lead the line, but she may see the pattern." First, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he placed the scroll back, quietly, and left. That week, Ma delivered a sealed message to QIL, and it bore no name, only a character she recognized, Ta to inspect. The letter was simple. It said, "There are whispers of a woman giving lessons in texts not hers to teach. The Bureau of Rights will be informed. If there is any truth, it must be ended." Killen burned the letter. Then she sat in silence for a long time. She had never intended rebellion, never published, never preached. She had only taught. That night, she sent Mai away with a scroll, her final lesson, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a silken thread. "Do not open it until the first frost," she said. Mai wept, but obeyed. The next morning, Killen emptied the inkstone. She rolled up the bamboo slips. She placed her anthology beneath the stove and covered it with ashes. She told Liang when she was ill and would rest. He did not argue. He placed warm coals near her feet and left her alone. She never resumed the lessons, but she didn't forget. Each day, she whispered a passage aloud to herself. under her breath, as if to ensure the words still lived inside her, even if she could never speak them again. What was written in the scroll Killen gave to Mai? What final lesson was deemed too precious to destroy, yet too dangerous to keep? Asterisk, the first frost came late that year. Mai had kept the scroll hidden beneath her sleeping mat, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with a silk thread, the color of river mist. Every night she checked it. Every morning she left it untouched. She did not open it when her uncle questioned her. She did not open it when the potter's daughter left town. She did not open it even when she heard that Shen Killen had fallen ill and stopped leaving her room. She waited, and when the frost finally dusted the garden steps in brittle silver, she opened it. The scroll was not long. It was a single strip of bamboo, perhaps 12 inches in length, written in Killen's delicate hand. No poems, no citations, just words. A farewell, a seed. You must never ask to be permitted to know. You were born knowing how to see, but the world will tell you otherwise. Let your questions be quiet. Let your knowledge be fierce. Teach one, teach only one. That is how it begins. Mai folded the scroll and held it against her chest. Then she buried it beneath a flat stone near the temple, as Killen had once taught her. Back in the house of Shen Killen, the winter was still and heavy. Snow clung to the roof tiles. Ink froze in the brush pots. Liang, when sat quietly near the stove, folding, put a copy of the Book of Rites into a wooden case. He did not speak of the lesson scroll. He had not asked Mai about it. He simply said to Killen that morning, "They will not come back." Killen nodded. "I know." She never taught again. She resumed household duties. She sat in the garden. Sometimes she wrote letters to no one and burned them before dusk, but she watched and waited, because knowledge she believed was like water. It seeps through. Years later, after Killen's death, a servant cleaning the stove found a bundle wrapped in aged linen. Inside, bamboo slips. So worn the characters were nearly lost. Not household accounts, not poetry. A collection of questions, reflections, discrepancies in the classics. Notes on women's names that had been removed from footnotes. Observations about the silence surrounding female sages, unacknowledged healers, uncredited scribes. The scroll was never signed, but one slip bore a final line in faint ink. A woman who asks is not unfilial. She is awake. That slip made its way somehow to a scholar in the capital decades later. He filed it among fragments, puzzled by the handwriting, the voice, the clarity. It was never attributed, but it was never discarded. And when the orphan girl, my older now, with 2 girls of her own, sat down with her youngest beside a boiling pot of water, she smiled and said, "Let's write something no one asked us to write." Because even in silence, Killen had given her the words, and they had endured. Asterisk, Italy, mid-14th century. A village near Mantua, too small for most maps, but just large enough for plague. Rumors to echo off its church walls and creep through its narrow cobbled lanes. The fields around it had been harvested late. The earth was damp. Smoke hung low, and The air was thick with the sharp smells of garlic, tallow, and wet stone. The autumn rains had softened the roadways, and now carts creaked through ruts half swallowed by mud. In the middle of all this, in a crooked stone house by the edge of the old Roman road, lived a woman named Pyrrha. Most people called her Lalavatras, the midwife, a quiet woman, perhaps in her 40s, neither beloved nor feared. She was the one people fetched in the dark hours between contraction and crowning, the one they called when the bleeding didn't stop or the crying never began. But few knew her other habit. When no one was watching, Pyrrha read. The book was hidden, always, wrapped in stained linen, tied with a strip of twisted wool, and tucked beneath the warped floorboard near her sleeping mat. She never brought it out during the day. She never opened it when there were children in the house. But at night, when the fire burned low and the baby cries faded, she'd sit by candlelight and untie the knot dot. The manuscript was old Ben-Hur, older than the Abbey library it had been quietly taken from years ago. It smelled of dry leather, vinegar, and crushed herbs. The ink was uneven, the text a blend of Latin and dialects no longer spoken. Some pages contained drawings, crude, anatomical sketches of wounds, pelvises, and things she recognized but could not name. It was not a book of magic, not really. But in a time when superstition and doctrine often tangled together, knowledge could feel like sorcery, especially when it belonged to the wrong person. And Pyrrha was the wrong person. She hadn't meant to steal it. She had been summoned once to the Abbey infirmary to help a nun through a difficult labor something, whispered about as a spiritual illness, though everyone knew what had happened. The woman had been sedated with poppy syrup, and Pyrrha had been left alone to clean up. The book had sat on the corner of the table, forgotten, part of a collection the abbess claimed came from the Holy Roman Court. Pyrrha opened it out of curiosity. Then again, by the time she left the abbey, the book was under her cloak. She never returned it. Asterisk at first. She could barely understand it. The Latin was strange. Some of the words had been abbreviated, others were invented. But as the months passed, the book began to make sense. It described birthing positions she'd never seen, herbal treatments for hemorrhage, instructions for stitching wounds, treating infection, breaking fevers. It described the internal body in a way she had never learned, connected, mapped. It was not scripture, it was observation, and it changed everything. She tested the techniques, slowly, one herb at a time, one method, put one breath. And when she found something that worked, something that kept the blood from rushing out too fast, or soothed a panicked mother, she wrote it down, not in the book itself, but in a smaller notebook she stitched together from parchment, scraps and old receipts. It became her mirror book, a reflection of the old manuscript, but in her own hand, with her own revisions, her own discoveries. She wrote nothing fancy, just things like damp compress, lavender plus yarrow, calms breath, bind mother near faint, child born feet first, rotate gently with hand at spines. The book was hers now, but she told no one, asterisk, because even though her skill grew, So did the whispers. Pyrrha uses herbs. The priest doesn't bless. She doesn't pray before the birth. She learned from someone, but no one knows who. In the village, fear moved quickly, so she kept quiet and worked carefully. Then, one winter, a baby died too soon, too small. The mother, a butcher's daughter, bled badly and lingered in fever for days. She survived barely, but her family blamed Pyrrha, and a priest who had long disliked her manner of healing said, softly but clearly, "Some books are not tell-meant for women to read." That spring, a friar arrived from Verona. He asked questions. Where had Pyrrha studied? What herbs did she use? Did she read Latin? She denied everything. But that night, she did not sleep. She burned the small mirror book. In her hearth, every page, every note, all except the original manuscript. That she could not burn. Instead, she placed it inside a clay jar, wrapped it again in linen, and buried it near the old well, a few feet deep, beneath a flat stone, marked only with a small spiral, made from pebbles. She thought that would be the end of it. But a month later, someone knocked at her door. A girl, no older than 16, eyes wide, hands trembling. "My sister's in labor," she said. "They won't let you come, but I want you to tell me what to do." Pyrrha stared at her for a long time, then whispered, "Fetch me to clean rags, and bar a branch of yarrow." And so it began again. What became of the buried book? Would it remain hidden forever, its pages sealed in clay beneath layers of fear and silence? Or would someone find it someday and read? Asterisk, the girl returned the next evening, mud still caked on the hem of her skirt. She had blood on her palms, dried brown, flaking. Her eyes were glassy, her voice cracked. "She lived," she whispered. "The baby, too." Then she sat down beside Pyrrha's fire and began to cry. They never spoke about the birth again. Instead, the girl, her name was Teresa, came back each evening with questions. At first, she said she only wanted to help fetch water, salt herbs, clean cloths. But Pyrrha saw the way she watched, the way her fingers moved over the edge of the mortar, the way she repeated words under her breath. The girl had a hunger for knowledge, not for power, not even for praise, but for understanding. So Pyrrha gave her a task. "Write down what you did," she said. "Every step." "I can't write," Teresa replied. "Then I'll teach you." They began with soot and cloth, no paper, no ink, letters drawn with ash and the ends of sticks. Simple symbols. Latin phrases Pyrrha remembered from the old manuscript: tumor sanguinis, spina sacra, infans nan, versa tur. Teresa caught on quickly. She was smart, unafraid, careful, and just like Pyrrha. She never asked why they did it in secret. She already understood. By late summer, Pyrrha trusted her. She told her where the manuscript had come from. She described the drawings, the notes, the way the diagrams had taught her things no man ever dared explain. She didn't speak of the clay jar, not yet then. One night the priest arrived, not the old one, the one who had always grumbled about Herb, but a new one, younger, smiling, with soft hands and curious eyes. He praised her work, said the bishop had heard of her skill, that her name had traveled. Then, casually, "I understand you studied somewhere." She lied, said she had learned from her grandmother. "That's good," the priest replied, "so long as you haven't read anything dangerous." He smiled again and left. She knew the questions weren't over that night. She woke Teresa just before dawn. They walked to the well in silence. The grass was damp, the air still. Piera pointed to the stone spiral. Here, Teresa knelt and helped dig. The jar emerged slowly, caked with clay and time. The linen had rotted slightly at the edges, but inside the book was still whole, still quiet, still waiting. Piera unwrapped it with trembling fingers. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Piera looked at Teresa and said, "It must go further. Bend us." And Teresa nodded. Over the next weeks, they worked together every night. Teresa copied the manuscript page by page, word by word. She asked no questions, only clarified letters and guessed at the faded margins. They created a second book, not an exact copy, but a living one, with notes, clarifications, additions based on Piera's years of practice. Teresa titled it, "For Those Who Come When the Bells Do Not." It was never meant for doctors. It was for women like them, called in secret, trusted in darkness, forgotten at daylight. But it couldn't stay in the village. So they wrapped it in oilcloth, tied it with red twine, and gave it to a traveling wool merchant's daughter, a woman with a sick child, whom Piera had once treated for free. She had family near Bologna. She promised to take it north. No names, no mention of origin, just a bundle, just knowledge. A week later, the priest returned with 2 men. They claimed they were searching for unlicensed texts, foreign knowledge, herbal sorcery, things not aligned with church doctrine. They searched the house. They found nothing. The jar was empty. The scraps were gone. The original manuscript had been taken to the woods and burned in silence by Piera's own hand the night before. Only ash remained. Still, rumors followed. She was not arrested, but she was watched. The townsfolk grew cold. No one knocked for her, touring labor anymore. They called for younger women, or priests, or no one. She was left alone, but Teresa stayed. She didn't call Piera teacher. She called her Madre di Parole, mother of words. She began writing her own notes, started a new book hidden in her apron seam. It was never about rebellion. It was about remembering, because books may burn. But what a woman learns with her hands and eyes does not vanish in smoke. What happened to the copied manuscript in Bologna? Was it lost, sold, burned, or did it survive? The journey to Bologna took nearly 3 weeks. The wool merchant's daughter Marina traveled with her uncle's caravan, nestled among bundles of raw fleece and bolts of rough-spun linen. She said nothing of the wrapped manuscript hidden, put in the base of her satchel, beneath her clean shift, and 2 loaves of flatbread. She didn't know what was in the bundle. only that it had saved her child's life, and that was enough. When she reached Bologna, she gave the scroll to her cousina, woman who worked in a bookbinder's shop near the university. The cousin unwrapped it, read a few lines, then wrapped it again. "It is not a book for scholars," she said quietly. "But I know someone. That someone was a woman named Alba, who ran a small herbal dispensary on the edge of the artisan quarter. Alba could read, barely. She had once worked as an apprentice to a lay sister in Ravenna, copying tincture recipes for aching joints and bad lungs. She knew a little Latin, enough to see that the book in her hands was not superstition. It was structure. It was care. She added her name to the inside cover-just initials, APL, and then she copied it again. By the end of that winter, there were 3 copies, each wrapped in different cloth, each with slight variations in margin notes, measurements, observations. They moved through hands slowly, from midwife to herb seller to LAUNDRESS. Never openly, never proudly, but always with purpose. Meanwhile, far to the south, Pyrrha's name faded. From memory, she grew older, weaker. One spring, she caught a fever and never recovered. Teresa was with her until the end. Her final words were simple. "Did you write?" Teresa nodded, and that was enough. Teresa buried her in the garden. No headstone, just a smooth stone marked with a spiral, like the one they had once dug up together. Then she left the village. She carried no bags, only a folded piece of parchment, sewn into the lining of her bodice. On it, 4 lines written in her hand. A child's breath is a kind of truth. A woman's silence is a kind of fire. What is known need not be loud. Let the hands remember what the mouth cannot say. Asterisk, decades past. The copied manuscripts, those that survived, eventually made their way into medical library, catalogued under anonymous female practitioner, dismissed by some, studied by a few. None were published, but none were destroyed. One discovered centuries later, or a faint note in the back margin. This was learned by doing. This was shared by trust. This was never meant to be alone. It had no name, no author, but one of its final pages included a familiar drawing, a spiral of pebbles, inked carefully, not explained. A signature only one woman could have understood, in the city of Bologna. A young woman studying early medicine once copied a recipe from that manuscript. She wrote it down in her journal, added 2 notes from her own work, and then closed the book. She didn't know who had written the original, only that it had worked. The fire that burned Pyrrha's original book did not end its story, because it had already taken root, carried on the backs of women who didn't need permission to remember, and never once asked for credit. Asterisk, Baghdad, 9th century. The city was a mind made of marble and wind, of paper and perfume, of scholars in silk robes, and students who drank tea with their fingers stained in ink. The Abbasid Caliphate, at its height, pulsed with thought and calculation. Astronomy, medicine, philosophy knowledge hummed in every madrasa and library, every domed observatory and market stall that whispered math in between, mint leaves and dates. And somewhere in the back corner of this great thinking city, behind a dye merchant's shop and 3 doors away from a bathhouse, sat a woman with a pen. Asterisk. Her name was Fatima bint Abi el-Hakim. Most people knew her only as the sister of the merchant who sold prayer rugs, dyed in crushed walnut and turmeric. What they didn't know was that Fatima's hand was behind at least a dozen Quran manuscripts that had passed through the House of Wisdom itself. Calligraphy in Abbasid Baghdad was not merely a craft. It was an act of devotion, of science, of political display. The shapes of letters were not just writing, they were architecture. Scholars debated the curve of a cough, the length of a lamb, the breathing room between dots like poets dissecting. By a single rhyme for decades, Fatima learned by watching her father. A copyist for a small mosque allowed her to refill his inkwell and sweep the floor. He had no sons, no apprentices, but he allowed her to sit beside him quietly and hold the burnishing stone. He never taught her formally. He didn't need to. She learned by repetition, by absorptions, by the rhythm of his strokes, and when he died, she kept his reed pens. She began copying prayers in secret. At first, just dua simple invocations, then verses, then longer chapters. Her hand was steady, her spacing precise. She imitated the Kufic script of her father's old work, then invented flourishes of her own. By 20, she could write better than most of the boys studying under official teachers, but she couldn't sign her name. Women were not banned from calligraphy, not officially, but they were rarely trained, almost never commissioned, and absolutely forbidden from copying Quranic text for public distribution. Because writing sacred words in sacred form was more than art, it was authority, and that was dangerous. Still, her brother knew. He saw the ink under her nails, the calloused fingers, the faint smell of gum Arabic in the house long after midnight. At first, he said nothing. Then, one morning, he returned from the market with a stack of blank parchment sheets. He didn't look her in the eye, just said, "If you're going to do it well," and left. She copied an entire Jew's 1/30th of the Quran by candlelight over 3 weeks. Her brother showed it to a merchant friend, a man who had lost a commissioned scribe and needed a replacement quietly. He read the script. He nodded and then asked, "Who is he?" Her brother hesitated. "Someone who doesn't want to be known." The arrangement began slowly. Fatima wrote. The merchant paid. No names, no signatures, no records. But her style could not stay. Anonymous forever. She had a distinct touch-tight flourishes on the ra, elongated breaths between ba and ya, the occasional ink dot drawn as a precise teardrop. Scholars noticed, collectors whispered, and one day a judge from Wasit visited the merchant and said, "I want to meet the hand behind this script." The merchant lied, said the calligrapher had left the city, but now her secret was no longer entirely hers. That night, her brother warned her. "Stop now," he said. They will not punish you for your skill. They will punish you for your name. She didn't respond. She went into the storage room, pulled out her father's old scroll box, and retrieved a sheet she had never shown anyone. A Buzmala written, with gold dust and cobalt, surrounded by a floral border drawn entirely in black ink, dot at the bottom. She had written her name in tiny Arabic script. Fatima bint Abd al-Hakimit was the only time she ever signed her work, and she never showed it again. But what became of that unsigned work? What happens when a hand is known, but the woman behind it cannot be named? Asterisk in the mornings, the city sang. Vendors shouted over plucked lutes. Copper bowls clinked as they were scrubbed clean in the alleys. Water wheels groaned from canals that carried more whispers than water. But inside the back room of the dye shop, all was silent except for the soft sound of a reed pen dragging. Fatima copied by lantern light, wrapped in modest linen, her hair tied back with twine. Her fingers ached, but the pages kept forming. Her style had evolved beyond imitation. Her curves were confident, her spacing intuitive. She didn't need to measure. She could see balance like a tailor sees symmetry. But each letter she drew brought her closer to a choice she didn't want to make. Her brother's warnings grew louder. Whispers were moving. Not just admiration, but suspicion. Why had this merchant's calligrapher never been seen in public? Why were the scripts too delicate to precise, like the hand of someone trained differently? Fatima knew how fast admiration could rot into accusation. She had seen it before. A woman in their district once praised for her talent in a Stramian till. She corrected a man's chart at the public square within a week. Her telescope was broken, and her name was gone from the registry. Fatima did not want fame, but neither did she want Erasure. So she devised a compromise. She created a false name, a man's name, Ahmad al-Zahiri. She even invented a short biography for him. A reclusive scribe who preferred to live outside the city gates. He had studied in Basra, but returned to Baghdad to copy only when commissioned discreetly. No one ever met him, but everyone wanted his work. Orders poured in. Small mosques, wealthy patrons, even a collector in Kufa. Fatima kept up, slowly. She limited herself to 2 pages a day, 3 when the house was quiet. She charged little. She insisted that her scripts be stored in protective wrappers to prevent warping. She corrected every single line that smudged, even if it meant rewriting from the beginning. No one questioned her process. No one cared, as long as Ahmad al-Zahiri delivered on time. And then one day, she received a different sort of commission. A scholar from the Beit al-Hikmo, the House of Wisdom, had requested a private Quranic manuscript, not for the public, not for the mosque, for his personal collection. The merchant delivered the request, eyes wide. "This is serious," he said. "You cannot say no." She accepted and spent the next 40 nights on the work. Each page took 3 hours. Her pen carved light from the parchment. The final sheet was a rendering of Surah al-Nur, the light, her own favorite. When it was done, she tucked a small note inside the last page, hidden behind the margin. Not a name, just 4 words. This hand is a woman's. Weeks passed. Then the merchant returned with another. Envelopes sealed in red wax. Fatima opened it slowly. Inside, no punishment, no summons, no warning, just a note. May the ink of the righteous be weighed heavier than the blood of warriors. I will keep your secret, but I will never forget your script. Signed only with a symbol, a star. She exhaled, but did not relax. From then on, Fatima continued under her borrowed name. She trained no students. She shared no tools. But she did one thing differently. She began marking a single letter tiny, almost invisible in every manuscript she copied. The letter F.A. for Fatima.hidden, tucked into borders, slipped into flourishes. It meant nothing to others, but to her it was proof that she had existed, that she had written. What happened to the name Amat al-Zahiri? Did it become legend, passed from scribe to scribe? Did anyone ever find the truth tucked between those pages? Asterisk, the name Ahmad al-Zahiri became known beyond Baghdad by the end of the decade. Copies of Quranic pages bearing his script were being traded in Damascus, admired in Fustat, even referenced in a scribe's manual near Nishapur. Scholars praised the Zahiri style, elegant, restrained, rhythmic. Some called it unmistakably devotional. Others noted its soft but firm spacing. Fatima watched from the shadows of her brother's home. She did not correct them. She did not reveal herself. But inside her private sketchbook, she wrote every reference down. Each time someone praised Zahiri, she added a mark, and each mark felt like a seed buried beneath silence. She continued her work in secret. Over the years, her hand slowed, her sight blurred, her fingers ached more than they used to. But still she copied, and still she left her secret, marked the tiny, in the margins, nestled between flourishes, or disguised as decorative symmetry, not in every page, just in the ones that mattered, her favorite passages, the ones she read aloud when no one else was awake. As the Abbasid court grew more chaotic court between factions, poets, and viziers, the appetite for manuscript beauty only deepened. Calligraphy became a display of power. Wealthy collectors commissioned illuminated Qurans to impress guests. Libraries hoarded rare scripts. Schools developed signature styles. And yet Fatima kept her quiet rhythm until the day she could no longer hold the pen. It was her eyesight. Her vision faded so gradually she hardly noticed. A missed stroke, a smudged curve. She wept alone the night she realized she could no longer draw a perfect gene without trembling. Her brother sat with her that night and held her, ink-stained hands. "You've written more than 1,000 men," he said. "I've signed none of it," she replied. He said nothing more, but the next morning he brought her a scroll, old, heavy, one of her earliest works. She hadn't seen it in over a decade. "I kept this," he said. "I told everyone I sold it, but I kept it." At the bottom of the page, in her youthful hand, were the words written by Fatima bint Abd el-Hakim. She smiled. Fatima never married. She trained no students, but she left behind a trunk of unfinished scrolls and margin notes. And one day long after her death, her great-niece, cleaning the storeroom, found it. Inside was a collection of pages wrapped in cloth. Some ink faded, others unfinished. The girl could not read well, but she recognized beauty, and when she took one page to a market scribe for identification, he stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "This is Zahiri's hand, but this margin it's signed." He pointed to the corner dot, to the tiny letter, asterisk. "Who is Fa?" he asked. The girl shrugged. "I think she was my aunt." The scroll passed quietly through hands again, this time with a footnote, possibly the work of a woman. It was the first time the words had been written, not forbidden, not impossible, not anonymous, just possibly. And that was the crack in the door. Centuries later, scholars would debate whether Fatima had truly existed. Some claimed she was Inventida, romantic story tucked behind a masculine pen name. Others pointed to the patterns of markings in Zahiri manuscripts and said, "No man signs this way." A few, quietly, simply believed. They said, "This script is too careful, too quiet. It feels like it was written by someone who never expected to be heard, but could not stop speaking." Fatima never asked for recognition, but the curves of her letters lasted longer than names ever do, because ink once dried does not fade. It waits.